Shalom from Israel, I'm Ariel Ben Aram. This week we read Parshat Matot, which has to do with the tribes, the term Matot. Last week we read Parshat Pinhas. We didn't refer at the end of the Parshat, actually not at the end, in the middle, after this plague that killed thousands of Jews during the issue with Midian and Moab that we reflect on last week. God asked Moses to have another census for obvious reasons. A lot of people died and in that plague, and he wanted to count the children of Israel again, to basically to keep the account, like to know who's in and who's out, so to speak. The counting, we mentioned this matter of the counting for the same reasons that the censuses were commanded before. We are counted because we count. That's the whole idea. So it's a message that God is telling us, that we have to be counted every time that we fall. It's like no matter what, we're still His children. We still have a mission. So the fact that some of us fail doesn't necessarily mean that we are not related to Him all the way around. It's like the reasons to be aware of our connection with Him is even more relevant when we have problems, issues in the way we approach the material world based on what God wants us to do, to be, and to have. So after that census, it's interesting, the holidays are mentioned again. So it's like the connection that we know we have with God, the major symbol of this connection is the holidays. Especially the three main holidays, Pesach, Shavuot, and Sukkot. Those holidays, again, we bring in each one of them sacrifices, offerings, to celebrate our connection with God. We have to be aware that these three holidays represent three major events: the Exodus from Egypt, the giving of the Torah, and our relationship, our connection with God in Sukkot, when we were dwelling in huts, in these small dwellings that we build in the desert. So, but that doesn't mean that the rest of the year we're disconnected. Those are reminders of the connection that we have to be aware permanently. Our connection with God is permanent. It's not part-time, it's not temporary. It's permanent. So we have to be aware of that. Well, that means that in everything we think, everything we discern, everything we feel, everything we say and do, this connection must be present. Now, of course, it's difficult because egos, fantasies, and illusions don't allow us to be constantly aware of our connection with God, which is keeping God's will, not ego's will. But that's the challenge. That's the challenge of the Jewish identity. To be and do what the Torah is telling us that is our identity. What does that mean? And again, the bottom line, the whole basis of this is goodness. So we're talking about the Jewish identity, when we're talking about God, when we're talking about our connection with God, when we're talking about our life in the land, in the promised land. We have to approach all this as the goodness that we want to enthrone in every dimension, level, and aspect of our consciousness. So it's like the cause is goodness, which is God. God is the main cause of everything. Then the purpose is goodness too. It is interesting because we mentioned before in the blog, and probably here in one of the videos, we were talking about the 7 days of creation. And we refer to the 6 first days as the process in which we learn, so to speak, or experience life in the material world. And then we have this 7th day, which is how we apply all this learning of the 6 previous days, or this work that we do in these 6 days, into the 7th. So it's like everything we have learned, everything that we have experienced throughout thousands of years has a purpose. And that purpose is this 7th day, which is this Shabbat, this eternal Shabbat. So our sages say that the first in the thought of God and last in creation. So it's like when God, the message of what our sages are trying to tell us, saying that Shabbat was first in the thought of God and last in creation, is that the whole purpose of God's creation is the Shabbat, the Sabbath, as they call it in English. So it's like the first in the thought of God. It's like His conception is the goodness. But in order to achieve the goodness, to understand what goodness is, we have to pass through these 6,000 years, these 6 days of the week, in order to understand what is the whole purpose of the 7th, like the culmination, like the purpose of it. So let's always bear in mind that everything we do, even in our lifetime, even if we're not aware in this lifetime that this Shabbat, this eternal day in which everything is good, even if we don't know that, everything we have lived in our lives in this world has the purpose of getting into that day, into that realm, into that dimension, that everything is good. So actually we strive every day of the week for goodness in order to achieve the final, total, complete, absolute goodness that is the 7th day. So in other words, the whole purpose of life is goodness. Now that doesn't mean that we're not going to have goodness the 6 days. Of course, that's the whole idea. That we learn and live every day the goodness from which we were created, which is the goodness coming from God. So it's like life is actually a learning process to come to the awareness of goodness. That's what it's about. It's interesting because when our children are born, we're good to them. We feed them, we love them, we care for them, we protect them. It's like everything is about goodness. But then there's a time in the process when they grew up, society, whatever, stops that process. And then it's not goodness anymore. It becomes the rules of society. then consumer society, competition, bickering, and then all the goodness of love's ways and attributes which we have given, nurtured to our children, is lost. Not completely, but lost mainly. So let's never forget about that. That the reason why we are living is goodness. And the fact that we survive childhood, we're talking about the infant years, that's the proof of it. So the idea is to live by, for, towards goodness. But again, at some point we forget about that. So then the Torah is telling us, do not forget that. It's like be good every day for the sake of goodness. And then we have to understand that goodness as our essence and true identity. It's not something abstract or temporary. It has to be something permanent. So we don't have any problems with people who wants to be good all the time. But that's the whole idea. So, well, I'm good in my family, with my family at home, or at work, or in certain circumstances. After that, don't ask me to be good. So we ask, why not? So the idea is to be good all the time. Who doesn't want goodness all the time? The goodness of love's ways and attributes. But then let's not forget about that. Let's keep the focus all the time. The teaching about one of the teachings about last week's Parshat Pinhas is about precisely our connection with God. The jealousy in terms of the yearning, the desire to have this connection with God permanently, without any distractions from ego's fantasies and illusions. That's the lesson from Pinhas. It's not a difficult lesson to learn. We're jealous with what we love. We know that. There's nothing extraordinary about the jealousy of God and the jealousy of Pinhas. It's based on love. That we have to care, we have to protect what we love. It's essential. Then what would be less or different than God's love, from which all creation came from? But the idea is to know that. To know God's love, to know from where we came from. This is the Torah is telling us then. This is God's ways and attributes. Pay attention. And it's repeated all the time. Dozens of times in the Hebrew Bible, don't do idolatry, don't disconnect. And again, it's about being connected to the goodness that we want to make prevail, that God wants to make us prevail. I mean, He's telling us, make good, choose the blessing, choose life, choose goodness. Then that's the idea. Then, that was last week. Then we enter this week in Parashat Matot, which basically is about the beginning. It's about vows and promises. So it's interesting. We come from a situation in which we're supposed to be devoted and committed to our relationship, our connection with God. Then in this portion, the Torah is telling us, how about a vow? How about a commitment? How about a promise? So there's a reason why this one thing is connected with the other. This is very essential. So what is a vow? Now our sages say something very simple. They say, I use word is sacred. For him to violate it, it is a desecration. What is so important? What we say and what we promise and what we commit to. Why is so important? That the Torah is calling it a desecration. Then this is about, really it's not about words. This is not about a statement. This is not about essentially as a promise. This is about what we believe in. It's like when we make a promise, it's like we believe in what we need to do. Then we commit, we make the vow. Because it's about truth, it's about what is relevant to us. So we're not talking about little promises or little commitments or anything like that. We're talking about something serious here. So it's not necessarily about a word. Oh, this so-and-so words, is priceless or doesn't value, it's worth nothing. This is about what this person believes in and what this person doesn't believe in. That's what it's about. It's like when politicians make promises that they later can't or don't want to fulfill. Basically, they didn't believe in what they say they believed before. So they're liars, basically. Just like when we commit to something that we believe in, then we promise, we commit. So it's not about promising for promising or making a vow to making a vow. It's to stand by what we believe. So it's like people who get married, some of them make vows to each other. To the promises, to the wife or to the husband. And again, these vows are based on belief. It's like, I believe in our relationship, I believe in you, therefore I commit to you. That's the essence of a vow. So this is not about words, this is not about, I'm going to show you how much I love you that I'm making this vow, this promise to you. This is not really about that. It's really about the truth that I believe in the other person. So we're sharing truth. We're sharing something that is common between us. Something that we agreed upon. That's why we're getting married. Then the vows are part of that. So the vows in this context, the vows are to reaffirm the agreement, to reaffirm the mutual understanding regarding the relationship, regarding each other. So this portion starts with the vows. It's like, just be careful with what you commit to. You have to stand by what you believe. So if you don't believe fully in something, do not commit, do not make a vow. So later they explain how to break the vows. But again, the essence is what we just mentioned. Then in chapter 31 of the book of Numbers, in this portion, we underline something here interesting, saying, Hashem, God, spoke to Moses, saying, take vengeance for the children of Israel against the Midianites. Afterward you will be gathered unto your people. Now, it was before Moses' death. God asked him, there's going to be a war against Midian, and these people have to be exterminated. Why? They were not enemies, declared enemies of Israel. They were not part of the promised land. But then they joined the the Moabites, to destroy Israel. So it was something completely uncalled for. So this kind of enemies that they have no reason to hate or to destroy a particular nation, they have to be destroyed. Now, how we do translate this in our consciousness? What are those nations that don't belong to our consciousness, to the goodness of the promised land, that we have to destroy? What are these nations? These nations are the thoughts, the ideas, the feelings that are completely alien to us, that we're not related to them. Like cruelty, for instance. Some people are not cruel. They may be indifferent, they may be indolent, they may be envious, they may be wrathful, but not necessarily cruel. Okay? So the issue here is we're talking about a particular quality that is not part of our consciousness. Therefore, if it's not part of our consciousness, we should eliminate it. It shouldn't exist at all if it's not part of our consciousness. So if there's something exterior to us that we see that is completely inhuman, it's like this is not part of human nature. As we see many crimes lately that are committed, many atrocities that we say, is a human being can do that? Is it possible that human consciousness can fall so low to do these things? Like butchering children and women, for example, in a civil war. So what's the need to kill defenseless people that are not part of a war? So this is like inhuman. This is how base this is, how low. But still there is. So this is the kind of traits, the kind of trends in consciousness that we have to destroy, to eliminate completely. So it's interesting because Moses gave this commandment to the people to eliminate children, women and children in this war against Midian. And then these people, after winning the war, they came back. We're talking about the army of the children of Israel. And they didn't kill the women and the children. And then Moses got angry. It's like, why? If you read the portion, we suggest you to read it. It's like, why you didn't do that? It's like we will have to exterminate every possible trait, every possibility of being so low in our consciousness. So we cannot leave anything, not even children or women, nothing. Now, it sounds ruthless, but again, we have to understand it in the context that we said before. We're talking about people, these Midianites, that are very cruel. That is, it's an uncalled for cruelty. This is no reason to be that way. Then what's the point? So why people have to behave that way? So that this kind of trait in consciousness, we have to eliminate it completely, even women and children, meaning even what is the least possible cruelty in them. It's like still this cruelty, like the little children or the women, because it's the same people. Then our mystic sages explain this. It's like the people of Israel spare the women and children of Midian because they knew that they could transform them. It's interesting. Some of us don't believe that evil is redeemable. But again, the idea is to transform it, not necessarily to redeem. It's like, okay, you're bad, join us. No matter how you are, you're gonna join us. We're not talking about that redeeming, that redemption. We're talking about transforming these opposite traits in consciousness, if they belong to consciousness. As we have said before, there are things that are so inhuman. Is this part of being human? Like being that cruel? So again, the whole idea of sparing the lives of women and children in our war is to transform them into goodness. It's like they make it part of us, but in order to do that, they have to be good. So immediately after this comes the loss of kashrut, which I reminded again because we have mentioned before. The Torah referred to the loss of kashrut a few times before this moment. But again, that brought up again. Why? Because the loot of the war against Midian was big. These people had gold, they have possessions, they have artifacts that could be used. So then there's a consultation here in which the children of Israel, the soldiers came to Moses and said, we want to keep this loot, this booty of the war. What should we do? So then Moses consulted with God and he said, hey, they have to kasherize everything. So the things that are with metal, they have to be put through fire. And then the ones that are not metal, they have to be washed. And again, the whole idea is about the cleaning through fire and through water, as we have mentioned before in other commentaries and in our blog. We have referred to this many times, the kind of cleanings that the Torah is teaching us through water and through fire. Again, the idea is to purify. So let's be aware that it's not about destroying the artifacts, it's to kasherize them. Make them kosher through fire and water. So they're not talking destroy them in fire or destroy them with water. It's to clean them. Then again, we have to understand that fire and water are means to clean. So what they do represent. So what is this fire through which we purify things that we used in daily life, artifacts, tools. So let's remember that there's a fire in the Mishkan, in the tabernacle, in the temple of Jerusalem. This is a permanent fire there. We know that. We read it before. And again, all the offerings that we bring, they have to be consumed by this fire in order to be elevated to God. So again, we understand that fire transforms the offerings. So it's not about necessarily destruction. Yes, some of them get burned completely. But again, we have to understand what these offerings represent. But again, putting something into fire is to transform it in order to make it useful. How do we transform in our consciousness things in order to make them useful? What is the fire that we use? We call it love. The goodness of love's ways and attributes. That's how we kasherize in our consciousness. In order to make things good. It's like you have to be good. The fire will make you positive. Same thing with water. And again, water is more like about a learning process. We relate waters, again, many times we have said this, to the Torah. The Torah is water. So it's like the kasherizing through water. We take a dish, a pot, put it into water to kasherize it. It's like we have to give this sacredness, this purity of the Torah, the waters of the Torah, in order to make that utensil, that tool, that artcraft positive, really useful, that we can use in everyday life. So it's like we can transform through learning. That's the water thing. It's like the mikveh, when we go to cleanse ourselves in water. Yeah, it's a physical action that we are commanded to do. We do that. But again, we have to translate that cleansing in our consciousness. So the Torah learning, that's the Torah waters in which we immerse ourselves in order to become pure. And again, returning to the fire, same story. See, we cook to eat, not to burn the food. Why? Fire is the catalyst. So we transform things in order to make it edible. So again, the way we translate that in our consciousness is in order to consume, to nurture ourselves with something, we have to process it through cooking, through fire. So again, it's not about destroying the food, it's not about destroying the utensil, the metal thing that we have to put through fire. We have to make it pure. And again, making it pure is to infuse goodness, infusing love in that utensil in order to make it pure. In order to be used for something pure, by the way. So this is not about casherizing and putting through fire and water just to do that as a mechanical thing, as most of us do every day. We have to think what is behind the idea. And then have the clear intention when we casherize something through fire or water, that this is about our consciousness. Like having all these ideas, all these thoughts that may be alien to us, and clean them up. Put them through the fire of love, to the learning of God's ways and attributes, the waters of God's ways and attributes, in order to apply them to daily life, in what we think, what we say, and what we do, and also what we have. This is very important, and it's an inner dimension in everything that the Torah is telling us to do. That's what we do in here, these videos and the blog, to try to expand so people can have a broader idea and a deeper idea about what goodness means. So everything here is for the purpose of goodness. That's the whole idea. So it's not doing things for doing things. Okay, so later in the portion, again there is a reminder of purity somewhere. Yeah, and as for you, encamp outside the camp for 7 days, 70 period. Whoever killed a person or touched a corpse shall purify yourself on the 3rd day and on the 7th day, you and your captives. In this case, God is telling Moses, okay, they have these women, children, prisoners. Okay, they have to go outside into the camp into a 7-day period of purification. And again, this purification is about transforming the people who touched a corpse and the people who are in contact, physical contact, with women and children from an enemy that we are commanded to destroy. So this 7-year period, this is about the transformation process, after which they will return to the camp, Israel camp, and integrate normally to daily life in the Jewish community. That's the idea. But again, it's to emphasize that the issue here is about purification. Then the loss of kashering utensils comes immediately then. Then they're talking about the division of the spoils, the booty, the loot that the children of Israel gained after the war. And then there's a request of the tribe of Reuben and Gad to possess lands that at that moment were not assigned to the children of Israel at that time particularly. But in general, the Torah gives us a broader borders for the future. For the future means after that, when the redemption comes, when we unify our nation in our land, then we're going to have broader borders. But at that time, they were not, so these two tribes, Gad and Reuben, requested from Moses to occupy part of the lands at the east of the river Jordan in order to give space to the cattle, which according to the Midrash, there were thousands of heads of cattle that they took from the people of Midian after the war against them. So they needed basically an area which was fertile, as it is the Jordan Valley. And Moses agreed with the condition that part of the tribe of Menashe will join them. So Menashe were distinguished for their Torah scholarship. Unlike Gad and Reuben, the tribes of Gad and Reuben, which were mostly warriors. They were not people who were very religious in terms of Torah study. So that was the condition of Moses. So the tribe of Menashe will dwell among them to teach them Torah. And also another condition was that in case of war, they have to be in the front lines. The Reubenites and the Gadites. So like they were the warriors, they were the people who were the strongest among the soldiers of the children of Israel, the nation. So Moses told them, if there's a war, you have to commit to be in the front lines to defend the nation, which they agreed. So that's how the portion ends. We hope that we convey the message about our connection with God when we are accounted for. That we must be accounted for what we believe. Then after that, accountability of being counted by God after having losses in a war. Then comes the loss of the vows, which is about accountability. So again, everything is connected, and we have to pay attention to that. Then after that, we relate to the loss of purification again. It's like if you see, we have been going back and forth, purity, sacredness, commitment to our relationship with God, accountability. Is a repeating process throughout the Torah. In one indirect way, in the first book of the Torah, the Genesis, and in a more direct way in the rest of the books. So let's just pay attention to that, and again, let's try to be aware as much as possible all the time that this is about goodness. The whole purpose of life is goodness. So we try to synthesize the main messages of the Torah as such. So we start getting positive references in every moment, in every choice we make every moment. It's like, let's bear into account that every decision that we make has consequences, and we all have to be motivated by goodness for the purpose, for the effect of goodness. And this motivation of goodness comes from love's ways and attributes, which are the material manifestation of God's love, the love of God. So with this we finish our commentary. We wish you an abundantly blessed week. Shabbat Shalom, and until next week.